Hello and welcome to Drew Davies Photography. This is my first video for my channel, and today I would like to talk about the Sony A7III when it's used with an MC-11 adapter and Sigma lenses. In this video we'll be talking about how the camera works with the MC-11 and how good it is when coupled with the Sigma 150-600 contemporary lens. Now, what I've done here is I've put together a little video here to show you the capabilities of the camera when tracking a subject. Basically, I'd seen quite a few comments on a few videos that were discussing the effectiveness of adapters, specifically the MC-11 and Sigma lenses, which was saying that effectively against Sony's own lenses that it wouldn't be as good at tracking as the Sony native lenses, which I have found to be misleading information. What I show you here when I go through the selection of photos is a 47 frame burst shot, and how the tracking abilities are able to keep up in virtually all wildlife and sports situations. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to move back onto the first shot, which is a bit of a contrast in detail considering. Right, this set of photos was taken in a place called RSPB Hamwall in Somerset. What I find nice about the place is that because it's so flat there, you can virtually pick out sort of wildlife off in the distance pretty easily. And with the lens that I use, why I use the lens specifically because of its focal length, I can pick up certain subjects well off in the distance and have plenty of time to prepare for anything that comes my way, really. As you probably can see from this photo already, that it's at some considerable distance. It was at a range certainly exceeding the camera's infinity. It's certainly exceeding into the infinity range of the lens. So we're talking about a subject that's well over 20 meters away. I would say at estimate this may have been about 30 to 40, possibly. Yeah, I would say about 40 meters away from the camera. And we're at a focal length here of 500 millimeters, and we get an ISO of 800, and of course the f-stop at that range is sitting at 6.3, and I've taken this shot at 1/5000th of a second, as I find that shooting generally on cameras at this sorts of speeds for these types of scenarios in decently lit conditions and with plenty of light is good enough to get a decent ISO rating, as you will see a bit later on. As I draw back, as the subject moves towards the camera, that ISO level improves a little bit when we hit the textures of the clouds in the background. So with the Sony, for this sequence, I was using the AF lock mode, which is the last function in the menu of autofocus options, which means that all the focus points are enabled, but to lock onto your target you have to start off in the center. So your center subject locks on, and then it's allowed to be tracked across the entirety of the frame rather than just the entirety of the frame choosing the lock on target. So as you can see, like I've shown already, and you probably can see, is that with this complex background going on, you've got a lot of textures going on here. It's picked the subject out straight away. Now, with that said, the target we're looking at here is a white subject. There is another bird that can be seen at RSPB Hamwall. It's one of his well-known birds called a marsh harrier. Considering the nature of the lay of the land there, it's very favourable towards this bird, and it can be seen quite on a regular basis there, swooping above the marshes in for to catch its food. And that bird, in contrast to the swan, is a lot darker so it's a bit harder to pick out. I will show another presentation of how well the camera does at tracking darker subjects against, you know, complex backgrounds. But this is the first still out of the camera. It's locked on pretty much straight away. I can zoom in a little bit more here, and you can start to see how far this is off. Now we're using full frame, of course, in a compressed format, not the uncompressed. And we're getting a bit of detail here, getting a bit of pixelation occurring. So really this is a type of shot that I wouldn't generally use, or, you know, sort of work on in post-processing to really use on my websites or anything, because the background, you know, at this sort of focal length is a bit distorted. It's losing detail. I should also point out that I was shooting with Ibis enabled on this camera, the image stabilization system that Sony uses in its cameras. Now what I've found with the Ibis system is that you can leave it on no matter what shutter speed you are using. I still need to do a little bit more testing with it, but generally I found that it's a very intelligent tracking system, image stabilization system, where you can leave it on a majority of the time. So when you're shooting at faster shutter speeds, you don't get the same effect from the lens when you actually use it on a native its native body, if you could say that, really, because the lens I use is a Canon Fit Sigma, and I found that the lens used to work much in a different way on the Canon cameras I used in the past, in the fact that the Canon bodies I had didn't have image stabilization built into it. So I found that if you left the image stabilization on, it would function the same virtually for all types of shutter speeds. What I'm finding with the Sony, when it's coupled with the Sony, even though it's a Canon Fit lens, is that I find the lens works much quicker on the Sony, probably because of the AF response, but the lens itself seems to be completely unlocked. There are functions like the focal range limiter. In other words, you can limit the sort of distance that the lens can sort of increase its responsiveness over a certain range. A lot of zoom lenses out there today, from all sorts of different manufacturers, do have some kind of focal limiting on the cameras. It's a little switch that's located on the side of the barrel of the camera, and it can be configured either for a full zoom range all the way off to infinity into the distance, to its minimum focal distance, whatever that might be, that would be located on your camera, or you can limit it to a certain distance. On the Sigma you can limit it between 2.8 meters to 10 meters, and then between 10 meters to infinity. So what happens there is that it cuts out for the distance between 10 meters to you, and only focus on 10 meters plus out into infinity. So that kind of narrows down your focal range and makes it more accurate and more responsive. So it generally doesn't tend to hunt then for subjects in front of that. So that's really handy if you have a subject that is in over 10 meters away from you, and things are past. So all those functionalities are actually working in the camera, I find it now. With the Canon, I found those other modes, I never tended to use them at all, but in certain scenarios where I've shot with the Sony, it seems to have it just been unlocked, and I find the function very useful. So the image stabilization is you know, probably possibly causing some small artifacts, I don't know, but I will point out that all my shots are shot handheld. So when I'm working out and about, I don't like to be confined too much to a tripod, because I find the one that I use is a bit heavy, and I haven't particularly got a great lens for a great tripod head for wildlife photography. Eventually I should be able to get a gimbal and attach it to my tripod and take it out, and I'd probably get some you know, probably smoother images, but generally the image stabilization for what I do is fantastic. And I mean, again, at this sort of focal length, I wouldn't use a picture like this. It's just simply too far off. So okay, I'm going to progress forward now and show you a few more. This is these three photos here are showing the bird passing in a sort of a diagonal direction, which is moving from right to left. Something interesting happens here. The bird starts to change direction. Okay, so this is something that happens a lot in wildlife photography, or just generally in wildlife, that the bird starts to ride the wind in the direction towards the camera. And I think this is a really good test to show how well the Sony sort of identifies the change in movement. And okay, I mean, this sort of range you're not going to get super sharpness, but knowing the lens that I know, certainly when coupled with Canon bodies in the past, I had to focus tune my Sigma using the USB dock, just to get a decent amount of sharpness in the infinity range, and I wouldn't get this kind of accuracy at this range. So that's a really good thing with mirrorless cameras, is that from what I understand there is very little need to use focus tuning or fine tuning adjustments. So as you can see, you know, we're zoomed right in here into the pixelated sort of, you know, sort of zoom range on Lightroom. And I mean, if you're used to using full frame, you could probably tell me, you know, what you think of this, but certainly from other photos I've taken in the past at these sort of distances, each one is being nailed, you know, and it's moving towards the camera. This is something that really interested me about Jared Polins. In Jared Polins' video made about Sony's 100 to 400 zoom lens, which he was saying that the responsiveness of it when you track in subjects that come towards the camera is really impressive. Now, when I watched this video, he was shooting at an event, I think it was Arizona, in the desert somewhere, and he shot a picture of a dune buggy coming over the sand dunes, and he was saying as soon as the subject had sort of reached the summit, it had already locked on. It knew, you know, it knew what to lock onto. And what I find, there's two examples I'm going to show you here where the first shot is nailed, like this one, and there's another one I'm going to show you a bit later on. So there's some slight, there's one or two where you could argue it's slightly out, but what I find is that when you use this lock mode, it's constantly scanning and it's picking out details of what it's trying, you know, what it's locking onto. At these sorts of speeds and these sort of distances, it's very hard for it to determine, you know, what to lock onto. Now, I haven't used IAF focus yet. I'm not sure at these sort of distances it would be very useful. I'll have to try it, but certainly at a certain distance maybe you would be able to lock on, or if it would be able to identify that being an eye at this sort of distance, considering that this bird's eye is sort of, you know, sort of blended in with its skin on its beak. Would it be able to identify that? I think it would struggle, certainly for this picture. But as it's going along here, it's still coming towards the camera. I would say the last picture there was slightly out, but I would say that the bird's head is at times moving back and forth. And swans generally, because they've got long necks, they do tend to, when they move in the wings up and down, the head does tend to kind of, you know, bob up and down in relation to the balance of the bird as it's flying on, you know, in the air. So this is, you know, I tell you what, it was, I would say it's, you know, a far cry from using my old Canon setup with this lens. So already, you know, I was already impressed by its capabilities anyway. But you know, to say that these lenses with adapters cannot focus, you know, or are not going to be as accurate is a load of rubbish in my opinion. So we're going to shift along here. Generally the image quality, this was set to an ambi setting. For Canon users might feel more comfortable using the ambi auto white balance setting on the camera. I certainly tried it. When I tried this out on this day, I like the tonal textures and qualities of that. I was used to that setting in the Canon, and it tends to give you a sort of a warm sort of texture and tone sort of in this sort of region, whereas in the natural setting on the Sony, it tends to be dropped a little. And I think, you know, this sort of white balance, you might be able to achieve it just by dropping the bar selector down here. I think that because there's not too much complicated lighting going on, and the photo's consistent, I would say that's around about what you would get on the natural white balance, perhaps a little bit pushed in the blues there, and maybe the tint. But if I just reset that there, yeah, this is typical. This is why I like Canon color science, if you want to call it that. I see it more as a philosophy, but Canon do tend to have their highlights a little bit pushed, and I've noticed that with the Sony, even in this ambi mode, the highlights aren't as pushed. And I'm talking about video here as well. You can check out Sony video and Canon video comparison. But what I didn't like about Canon, this is what I like more about the Sony, is that if I had taken this shot with a Canon, I probably wouldn't have had this kind of accurate focus for a start, but also my highlights would not have been of this kind of quality. You're definitely seeing sort of details here. Each feather, is kind of distinguished from the next, whereas the Canon, I think that the 72 anyway, at least, the highlights here would be very difficult to control shooting at these sorts of settings on the camera anyway. And if I drop the highlights down, you're getting some really good highlight recovery. It's going right down there, but I quite like the way the balance of the picture and the background there. Okay, so moving them along quickly through this set of photos, the general accuracy is being maintained. So what happens in a bit is you'll see that the bird at this point here starts to progress faster from left to right rather than towards the camera. So from this point onwards, the bird is going to start to accelerate. So as you can see, it's been moving towards the camera, so the camera's just been tracking this bird, which effectively looks like it's just getting bigger while it's flapping its wings and not really moving that far. So I'm just using this point here as an anchor, really, to show how sort of slow it's moving towards the camera in relation to the speed that it's about to move to. So here again, it's sort of strafing a bit, but now it's starting to progress faster. Now at these points, this is where the tracking perhaps got a little bit confused. There's not much of the photo that is out of focus. They're very minor details, okay? And considering that the bird has got much bigger in the frame, I would say that's only fractionally out. I mean, this is comparable with Jared Polins' video, where you've got a succession of shots. I'm certainly sure there are more shots in this 47 burst frame shot that it's only fractionally out at times. The only point where focus is lost, akin to DSLR cameras that I've used in the past, is towards the end of this burst frame shot, where effectively the subject is going out of the frame. So this again, look, we are about 30 frames into this burst, and it's still continuing to track. There is only some small details you'll see in a moment. Certainly not on this one because this is my processed one. But you know, you've got a handful of usable photos after about 20 shots into the burst, and plenty more as well. To my eye, when I first looked at them, they may have looked a little bit slightly out, but they you can certainly see it when it when you look close. But like you can see, it's absolutely phenomenal, an absolutely phenomenal autofocusing system. I cannot fault it. Certainly, this is like I would consider this to be like a basic type of scenario that a camera should be able to handle. You know, certainly for the money that you pay for some of these cameras, I would expect that you're using a telezoom lens and you want to track a subject. This is really a typical situation where it should just be doing its job. I mean, for a Swan that is white in colour, it stands out against most backgrounds, generally. So really, the camera should have, shouldn't have too much problem focusing. I can exemplify that here, simply because when, like I said, there's one here that's slightly out here. But you know, considering what we've been shooting so far, it's not much to to be disappointed about here as well. We do have a little bit of blurring, but this was my point. This is again, yeah, we're towards the end of the section of photos. This is there's these 4 photos here are the ones which went out, and as you can see, what is distinguishable about this photo is that the subject is starting to go out of the frame, and we can also see that there's a drop in light here, and that the bird is kind of being sort of merged with the background. So maybe the camera here has decided that at this point in time, with the light and everything, it's making a decision whether to switch to a different focal length. Maybe it's thinking that you're trying to track onto something else, or maybe it's got confused here. But this is the amazing bit. Okay, we get one more shot that's slightly, that's out of the frame slightly, and we're getting that loss of sharpness. But boom, right in with this. Okay, it's straight back in. So impressive. And I mean, there's been a few situations where I've been shooting with this camera and I've been tracking birds that move much faster than this beautiful Swan here, and it's done the same thing. If it goes out briefly, it seems to remember, and when you bring it back on, you track back onto the subject, it just seems to nail it, and that's really impressive from Sony. This autofocus system is absolutely phenomenal, even with non-native lenses and adapters. Certainly as far as Sigma are concerned anyway. I can't say that every lens is going to be this good, but I'm not going to mix my words. I will say that this lens, coupled with the Sony, has the kind of focus potential seen in Sony's 100 to 400. What I reckon is that I don't think that in terms of AF lock, I would say that the only upper hand that the Sony is going to have over the Sigma is perhaps that it might be a bit snappier, it might be a bit quicker, sort of locking onto the target, rather than I would say that Sigma in some situations perhaps takes a little bit of time. I wouldn't say it's unusable by any means, far from it. I would say it's well under a second, and it's well under half a second. I would say it's well under a quarter. Actually, I would say about a quarter of a second. I would say that it takes, if I'm going to guesstimate that, in most scenarios anyway. Even ones with complex backgrounds, I would say that it's pretty damn good at locking on. There's 1 or 2 occasions where it has struggled a little bit, but then it's been in low light situations. But considering how well it tracks in low light, you know, I'm like I would say, I would find it I would be very surprised in some of the situations that I've taken photos in, considering the lighting conditions, you know, weather conditions as well. Even if it does lock onto focus, if I would actually get use out of the photo anyway, considering there's certain sort of conditions I like for bird photography that look appealing when you process them out, whereas some others don't, and that's just generally down to the weather conditions and what's around at the time. So, you know, for these sorts of conditions, I mean, I don't really take pictures of many swans in flight, simply because where I live we do have a lot of swans, but I generally never find myself in a situation where one is flowing this close to me. So I'm quite happy with this, you know, and considering you know, it's quite high up, you've got these beautiful clouds that were present on the day to, you know, and I love shooting against cloudy backgrounds. I know they're an astrophotographer's nightmare, but for me, for wildlife, you know, they make beautiful backgrounds, and they really warm up as well when you sort of edit them afterwards, such as this one. I was really happy with this. Didn't take much editing to do. There's been a bit of manual noise reduction done on it, which I've inputted myself, but generally this is looking, you know, really good to my eye. You know, I could definitely use that. I haven't posted it yet, but certainly for the detail that's in it, you know, it's more than usable. So that is really that is one of the examples that I wanted to show you. I would like to know what you think of the AF capabilities. If you could leave in the comments below, that would be great. So I would also like to know what you think of this selection next as well. So I'm just going to skip on a little bit. I'll just give you a little bit of a background before I show you these pictures. These are photos that I took towards the end of the day, as I was about to leave the nature reserve. I just like to have a little sort of look around and see if there's anything that might be worth photographing, because you never know what can happen in nature reserves. Sometimes you can get lucky, but this is perhaps the most impressive aspect again of the camera. It's like that initial first look. It just seems to, in some of the situations so far, it just seems to nail certain shots first time. Now this one I'm going to show you here, it has been edited, and I will show you in the string of pictures what it originally looked like. Okay, if I find the ARW file, this is the original Sony file. So what I'm going to do here is reset this, because I think it's been cropped down. So this is the original photo, okay? There's a lot going on here and the angle's all squiff. Now what happened was, I was walking past the hide, which is situated on this pond, and this heron was actually tucked up behind the hide, and the herons tend to do this quite a lot. It's the second time this has happened to me down in RSPB Hamwall, and the heron saw me, knew I was there, and I startled the bird, and it flew off to the right, away from this hide. So what I tend to do is, you know, keep an eye on the bird, because generally herons are quite you know, quite tame, and they're not too bothered about people as long as they keep their distance from you. And what they tend to do, if you startle them, sometimes they come back round and land somewhere else nearby in proximity, just as long as it's a bit further away from you. So he circled around a little bit, and then he just sort of dived in and started to sort of skirt across the water, as you can see. And this was the first shot out of the camera, and it's completely nailed it. And I mean, this was an evening time, so the light was starting to drop a little bit, and this one has been taken again. It's at the, well, this is pushing between 500 and 600 millimeters, so we're losing. This should be a bit softer, which it is slightly, but it's when you start to drop these highlights down, you start to recover bits of detail. You know, you drop a stop and a half here, boost the whites a little bit, and the shadow areas. You're starting to get a half decent picture again. And if I pull a little bit more here, you can see that we back off a little bit, we're losing that shine from the picture a little bit, so you need to boost the highlights. So really this area here is the most complicated part of the highlights, because it's right catching the sun. This, as you can see, you know, the shadows coming in here, you know, the sun was starting to go down on the horizon a bit, and that highlight area there could probably be recovered. You know, generally if I boost the exposure a bit here, I could go in perhaps with you know, sort of a I'll paint out the highlights here, you know, for if you want to be pedantic about it. Drop down, yeah, no problem at all, and add perhaps a little bit of details around the face here. It depends how the picture's going to look. When you take out highlights, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it makes a picture, at other times it doesn't. So can we boost those highlights back up a little bit here? Possibly. But generally, you know, it cleans up pretty well. We're at ISO 2000 here, which, as you can see, is a little bit of grainy in the background. As I've stated earlier, I take out a lot of noise in pictures manually, certainly for bird photography at least, because a lot of the backgrounds tend to be sort of easier to manage, certainly in situations like this. Sometimes complex backgrounds, sometimes like trees, even though they are complex, they also kind of, when you're panned out, they look kind of merged, if you know what I mean. So taking details out isn't too much of an issue sometimes, but because the background here is sort of so vast in terms of, you know, the type of blurring that's going on is going from a focused aspect here to a blurred aspect. You've got to be careful about how much noise reduction that you use, because you don't want to make it look too artificial. So you need to reduce your noise reduction when you come down into working on this area. So just want to, you know, show how this tidied up a little bit. It worked out very nice. So again, going back to the focus abilities, I had to take out this subject here, this bird flying in front of the heron, obviously blurred out. The camera's distinguished this subject, and I think I was using the central AF point on this picture to lock on, so it's probably going to distinguish more with this subject than that, which I think, you know, arguably, you know, it's accurate in two respects, that this is the first frame out of, you know, the set of photos. So had the camera had hesitated at this point, I would have lost this fantastic photo, which I was able to sort of sort out and sort of readjust and bring the colors and tones out. But what we're going to do here, I mean, you can see how that picture's been, you know, sort of processed. These are the other photos, and just showing how well it's locking on here, continuing to lock on. Now, just to show you, know, nothing's always perfect. There are a few shots towards the end of the burst that are out of focus. But generally, I think I was using a large square central AF focus point here, and it's only until I get to the last few frames in the sequence where the focus gets lost. It's actually when it's actually still when it lands, and it takes about 5 shots to actually go back into focus. I think it's either this one or the next one. It's still out there actually, so it's about eight frames it lost there to being out of focus. But like, I think I've worked that out to be in that it may have got confused with this background and this subject here. It seems to have locked on somewhere off in the background, and over these three photos I'm showing you here, it seems to be shifting from focus in this area, which even again doesn't look quite right. Yeah, it's off here at the moment. Go back one more. Yeah, focus seems to have been acquired here for some reason. I'm not sure why. It doesn't seem to be anywhere here at all. Yeah, it is slowly creeping back in. So focus is bringing itself forward back onto this main subject. Unfortunately, even though we're still in continuous burst, it's still managing to, it's still trying to, lock on to a target that it seems to be happy with, rather than just giving up altogether. So I quite like that, you're still getting usable photos. I think that when I was using DSLR cameras, certainly the 72, I would find that if it couldn't acquire a lock any longer, it would just give up. It wouldn't try to reattempt to lock focus onto anything else. Where in this camera, I'm finding that it makes more of an effort to try and help you out, which is great, I always found a lot of situations with the DSLR, I'm just still shooting and I just realised then, oh, I've completely lost focus and the camera is just given up. I think it's just one of those instinctive things. You want to keep going when you're locked into the moment, when you're tracking a subject. You don't want to disengage the shutter. Certainly with DSLRs, I find that when you re-engage the AF system, that you lose track even more, that it either snaps to a background or whatever. And you feel this impulsive instinct, oh, I can keep shooting, hopefully the camera will re-engage the focus. And I found that this is the case with the Sony A7III. So, finishing up here, a bit of blow and highlights, but again, the highlight recovery on this camera is pretty impressive. It may be, it's blurry here, so, that again, is not through error of the camera. That's probably the movement of the bird perhaps moving very quickly, or it's probably me moving the camera back and forth, I'm not sure. These herons do tend to ruffle their wings quite a lot, and even though you may think it's something a camera should pick up, you've got to consider that when they do move quite erratically, it is quite a speed. It's hard for a camera to pick out, and unfortunately it's just the way of light that sometimes the way the birds move can be a little bit too fast for the shutter speed that you're using. Even for 1/5000th per second, it can be quite a challenge. It might just be too fast for the camera to pick out. So with this range we were talking, this was probably again about 20 meters out, so this was on the cusp of the lens's sharpness levels, considering we are now up to 600 millimeters. This is where the camera, this is where the Sigma Contemporary is known for being a bit soft. But what I've found when you couple it with a high resolution camera, that the performance of it increases dramatically. Certainly 20 megapixel camera would be struggling here. You may be getting a better crop, but you can crop these images right down on the Sony A7III. In fact, I'm finding that these subjects at distance, some subjects at least, clean up much better than when I was using a crop sensor, simply because the detail is being retained. If we boost this one in, for example, we are getting pixelation, but that's even at you know, that sort of distance with a bit of editing, that could be a usable picture. So in terms of what I bought the camera for wildlife photography, this is certainly going to yield me the results that I need, certainly when it comes to usable photos. You know, I'm getting far more of them now than when I was using crop sensor, even though the theory is that, you know, crop sensors, you know, gain you a bit of distance. I'm starting to feel that, you know, crop sensors really aren't for me anymore. I find that full frame really is the answer to this, even to the point where I mean, in the future I may consider the A7III, which is you know, a lot of, this is almost double the megapixel count of the A7III. Okay, so really, you know, this video now it's starting to push like three quarters of an hour. So I want to round off here. I hope you've enjoyed you know, my talk. I hope it hasn't been too boring. I know it has been a very long video. It has been completely off the cuff, and I don't usually make videos like this. I've been getting a bit of you know, practicing doing making videos, and I prefer this sort of way of going through photos. But it was just to exemplify, you know, just what this camera can do. And there are other examples I can show in other videos, briefer videos, which might help, you know, make a decision whether you think this would be a good wildlife camera for you. Certainly I haven't talked about its functionality and how good it is in these situations. For me, I find it a wonderful camera. I find it really quick. I find it, the control dials and the menu, they all suit my tastes. It may not be to other people's tastes, but moving from Canon, I find that I've gained in that department. And I just find that I'm making decisions far quicker when it comes to making snappy decisions like this. I've got, you know, a setup where you know, I can just switch to a certain mode, and I know which setting I need to use, you know, when the moment is critical. Because effectively I'm going to walk away with a usable picture like this every time. I hope, you know, it's certainly not disappointing me, and it's certainly not letting me down. I mean, on the same day I'm able to nail tracking from the very first initial shot, and in this case as well. I mean, again, you're talking about the difference between two different types of pictures and different distances between usability and simply keeping your eye on the subject, not to lose it. Of course, in comparison, we look here, you know, this is at the very sort of pushed end of this camera's of this lens's limitations anyway, and you go from that to the other one. You know, you bring this subject in and it's still tracking, and I can produce a usable photo for a publication perhaps, or just for my own use. You know, it doesn't matter. You know, it depends on what I'm being required to do. But when I'm getting results like this, certainly when you know, you're there for many hours during the day, when you're trying to capture a variety of subjects, you wanna come home with, you know, a maximum, as much of a maximum yield as you can get, really. So here I'm just going to round off quickly about, you know, how this can be beneficial to wildlife photographers. You know, because really it is about yield, because there is no point in having a camera that shoots 10 frames per second if it cannot nail focus. You know, it's not about chance, it's about, you know, it's about accuracy. AF, it's all about accuracy. I found that the 72, Canon 72 was a little bit hammy at times. You had to really coax, you know, the pre-autofocus on it, you know, by depressing the shutter down halfway. You had to, it kept you on your toes, but you know, I found that with the lens, you know, the lens has a manual override, which is a very useful feature, so that helped me out with a lot of tricky situations where the lens was, you know, back focusing simply because the AF point wasn't locking on properly. So with that function, you know, it kind of helped me out with a lot of tricky situations. And but with this, I find I'm using manual override much less, which is good because I'm paying more attention to what I'm shooting. It's making me, in some respects, because you know, even though I'm not trying to put down DSLRs, they are brilliant cameras. Certainly the 72, perhaps I'm putting it down a little bit, but it is a fantastic camera. Don't get me wrong. If you can get hold of one, certainly get one second hand. You know, they are fantastic cameras, really. You know, certainly on a budget now, you know, they're a few years old, you can get them second hand. They have great performance, and I would still have one if it wasn't for the fact I had to you know, exchange it to get the Sony and a number of my other lenses. It's a shame, but I've got to move forward. But you know, I've got to say that I wouldn't say that I'm losing out by not having it when I'm coming away with results like this. So really, you know, I typically only want to be using one camera body, and this camera body just seems to be doing all I need it to do, where I just can't complain about when it's producing results like this. So yes, when you're shooting 10 frames per second, you want to be getting consistent results like this. You want to have that kind of choice and variety of shots. And you know, even if it's like not the perfect shot, you can also, you know, do some small compositing just to kind of flesh out the detail. You know, you can be more creative. That's what I wanted this camera for. I wanted it to be more creative, and I'm thinking more. I'm being more creative with the camera, even in faster situations. And you know, just when it comes to aspects like choosing your white balance, you know, that's a feature that I found that was, you know, difficult to use in the Canon. Certainly the 80D has a similar type of ambience and natural white balance to the Sony. In terms of the dynamic range, they're totally different cameras. I would say that, you know, Sony have a very neutral balance to their pictures, and that for me works great. I find it's a little bit too on the flat side when you're using white natural mode, but this ambient setting for these kinds of conditions is absolutely brilliant. It's like using sort of the ambient, like I said, the ambient setting on the old Canon cameras, and that suits me just fine. Other things I can just you know, sort of finish up on is that you know, the white balance I find on the camera, there's all this talk about, you know, Canon color science versus Sony color science, where I find it's more of a philosophy. You know, it's each camera is configured differently. Certainly not all Canon, if you want to talk about Canon color science, well, all the cameras have a different color sort of dynamic range in terms of, and the way that the camera is configured for certain types of light. You know, the Sony is like, I would say it's just one, well, I would say it's one stop away from being a professional camera. I think the only thing that it does let it down a little bit is the weather sealing, from what I understand. But to be honest, you know, if you're talking about professional standard, perhaps, you know, you wouldn't want to take it and use it in a, you know, during a monsoon or anything. But generally, I wouldn't be worried about this using that camera, you know, like in relatively heavy rainy conditions, but in extreme conditions, yes. So I wouldn't say, you know, you wanna, you know, that's the only thing that Sony need to work on, I think, in the future, if they want like to really compete, is just get that weather sealing nailed. I mean, it's only a couple of areas of the camera where it's debated to be not as good, but I don't care. You know, to be honest, you're getting professional results. That's the end result, really, isn't it? You're getting professional results. You just got to look after your camera more. And certainly when you're on a budget, I ain't going to be complaining about weather sealing too much. You know, I think the weather sealing can be a bit overstated, and you know, you just got to make sure that you take some precautions. Certainly, I've shot in some situations where, you know, the weather's been quite extreme, and you know, I wouldn't say that I've ever had a problem with, you know, sort of wet weather conditions that have inflicted the functionality of the camera. And certainly the cameras we were using at the time weren't known for being super weather sealed either. So you just got to keep that in mind when making the decision. If people start talking about weather sealing, you're worried about the camera breaking down, I wouldn't, you know, get too overly concerned about that. You just got to do like what most photographers do, is just look after your gear and it'll look after you, simply put. So I hope you enjoyed my video, and you know, I shall hopefully have another one soon, and I will go a bit more into detail, and also hopefully have some more photos of different subjects, of the different variety of conditions to show you. So thank you. Please leave any questions or likes and stuff in the comments and the like bar, and I shall have another video for you soon. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.